Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Christine Gelowitz and I am the CEO of the association. Today I'm speaking to you from Victoria, BC, which is in the traditional territories of the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations. Joining me on this afternoon's panel are two members of the ABCFP's senior leadership team, Casey McCauley, Registrar, and Mike Leroy, Director of Practice. It is very timely to be talking about the Professional Governance Act, because it was just last week that the government deposited several orders in council that contain the regulations to bring the PGA into force on February 5th, 2021. Yes, that is just 2 days from now. But not to worry, the ABCFP Council and staff have been working hard behind the scenes to prepare the organizations and, of course, you for this change. And now that we have a timeline for implementation, I'm happy to be here today to start the sharing of details with you and to help you as a registrant prepare for the changes that will have most impact to you. So we have about 75 minutes for our session. We plan to spend about 20-25 minutes presenting some of the foundational information, and we're going to leave the remaining majority of our time for your questions. You can start adding your questions as we talk and as they come to mind to you. Just enter them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So before I get into the specific details of the PGA, it's important to briefly reflect about why we regulate professionals. At the heart of being a self-regulating profession is its registrants agreeing to act in the public's interest. The first way forest professionals agree to act in the public interest is when they agree to have appropriate education and skills and to maintain their knowledge and skills throughout their career so that the public can trust that only competent people are undertaking forestry practice. Second, forest professionals are acting in the public interest when they agree to always follow professional standards. That includes the standards for ethical and professional conduct, which tell the public what they can expect from every single forest professional 24 hours a day, every day of the year. Things like that a forest professional will have due diligence in how they undertake their work. That the forest professional will be professionally independent in both fact and appearance, to name but just 2 of the 9 standards in our new code. It also means following ABCFP guidance developed for particular forest resource activities like forest road crossings. This type of guidance includes specific practice standards as well as competency standards for the forest professional who provides this particular professional service. The third way professional regulation protects the public's interest is by having accountability mechanisms. Every forest professional agrees that their practice and conduct can be subject to review at any time. The public can ask questions and make inquiries into the conduct and practice of a forest professional, and the forest professional will be fairly, objectively, and transparently reviewed. Why would forest professionals agree to these things? Well, one reason is because forest professionals are granted exclusive practice rights, meaning only those registered with the ABCFP can practice professional forestry. But I think another reason is because people work hard to get their education, to get your professional designation. Not just anyone can achieve this. It's something to be proud of. And at the heart of it all, most forest professionals get into forestry because they love the outdoors and the environment, because they care about it and they want to take care of the forest that'll be here into the future. And last, why did the public ask for this extra layer of protection through professional regulation way back in 1940s? Because forests are part of BC's identity. They're intertwined with its economy, its clean air and water, and they're part of BC's culture and spirit. The public knew the management of forests wasn't best left to chance. Forests needed to be guided by environmental policies set by government and by people, and that the people undertaking the care of the forest needed to be experts who the public could rely upon and trust. So let's talk about the last few years getting to today and having a new act that's going to govern the forest profession. Less than 2.5 years ago, we weren't thinking about getting rid of the Foresters Act, and we hadn't even heard the title, Professional Governance Act. We went from an idea in a report to less than 6 months later, a 93-page act receiving royal assent in the legislature. Following the PGA being made law at the end of November 2018, a little more than 2 years later, here we are. We've been running our ongoing business operations, but we're also poised to rescind the Foresters Act and bring the PGA into force. This has truly been an incredible undertaking to do in such a short period of time. But it was possible because the ABCFP had good bones, so to speak. We had and have a solid foundation that we were working from. We have a council that understands its role to govern and staff that understand its role in the business lines. We were already doing what we're supposed to be doing, with the exception of firm regulation, of course. So the PGA isn't going to require the ABCFP to create a bunch of new business lines it doesn't already have. And part of the reason we're in this place is because back in 2008, the ABCFP increased its fees to where they are relatively today. And this allowed council to hire staff, to put more robust programs in place, and still have capacity to do extra things to support forest professionals to meet their professional obligations. So the Act, the Professional Governance Act, here it is in a really small nutshell. This Friday, it's going to come into force and the Foresters Act will be repealed. The PGA is very similar to the Foresters Act in that it continues to grant the ABCFP the privilege of self-regulation. We won't, however, quite have the same autonomy in our self-regulation as we did under the Foresters Act, and that's because the PGA also established an Office of the Superintendent of Professional Governance, or the OSPG, who now oversees the work of the ABCFP and all the other regulators who are under the PGA. This means that they're going to conduct audits of the ABCFP's operations. They're going to set standards for how we run our business, and they're also going to approve and file our bylaws. Lastly, they're going to serve as a hub to bring professional regulators together and assist us to develop shared products that are to all our benefit. Under the PGA, the fundamentals for the forest profession remain the same. A forest professional's regulation will continue our existing exclusive practice rights, albeit using some different words to describe it. And it'll continue to provide the protection of our existing reserved titles. New with the PGA, however, is the opportunity for the ABCFP to consider the regulation of firms who employ forest professionals. But this is something down the road for us to develop. So the Professional Governance Act is designed to speak to the ABCFP as a regulatory body. It directs what programs the association must have in place and the standards to which we have to deliver those programs. So, and as I mentioned, the ABCFP has nearly all the same programs in place before the PGA as it will after, but a lot of the specific rules for how we run those programs will change. And those specific rules take the form of bylaws. Our bylaws are where you can find the detail for how the ABCFP will undertake things like complaint investigations, or where you'll find the parameters of programs like the Continuing Professional Development Program or the running of AGMs. Some of these procedure details in the bylaws might be of less interest to some forest professionals, but some, in effect, will place a new obligation on forest professionals. These are the things that are most important for forest professionals to pay attention to and learn about right away. And they're what we're going to drill into with some questions right now with Mike and Casey. So now we bring Mike and Casey into the conversation. And we're going to do about 6 or 7 questions, and then we're going to open the dialogue up with you. And Mike, you're up first. Mike, forest professionals will be asked to follow a new code of professional and ethical conduct when the PGA comes into force. What is in the new code, and when will forest professionals need to start following it?
Thanks very much, Christine, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks. Even though you're asking me the question, Christine, I know we've all been in this together, and so if you guys want to chime in, if you think I missed something, please go ahead. First off, if the regulations are deposited, as Christine says, on the 5th, on Friday, then that's the day that we'll have to start following it. The good news is that the professional principles haven't changed. Those underpinnings of what are the previous code of ethics still exist today. So what is that new code? You can see in the graphic here, the code, that is what we're going to call it. We're going to call it the code instead of the Code of Ethical and Professional Conduct. The code outlines the ethical standards for forest professionals. The code is both outward and inward speaking. That is, it's a public expression of our commitment to society, and it's a standard by which we expect to be measured. So the code has 9 standards there. We took our current code of ethics and our practice standards, merged those together. Those were both bylaw 11 and 12 that we all voted on to have in place. And then we integrated the requirements in the PGA, which are in section 57. They're principles, 12 principles that must be included in each regulator's code. So we took those and we put those through. We then had our legal counsel draft and redraft the end result to ensure that there was a workable practicality. And that's where we ended up now with the code about the new code. The way I like to think about the new code, Christine, is standard 1 and 4. Standard 1 and 4 are the underpinnings of professional service. That is how we deliver it. Standard 5 to 8 are about the values we protect and we deliver on. And then standard 9 is the last, it's a capstone reporting standard. We referred to it before as the positive obligation to act. And that showed up in our current code, which will be over on Friday. But it is the positive obligation to act when you witness poor forest stewardship or misconduct.
So Mike, what kind of advice do you have to people about learning the new code? And is the ABCFP going to help forest professionals actually undertake that learning?
Yes, the urgency of it all. We have to know it on Friday. And I always remind myself that it takes a long time to grow a tree. And I know we've said that to the office. So even though forest professionals have learned the previous code, they have it on their wall, they've internalized it through their work over the years, there'll still be the time it takes for human behavior to absorb it. So we've worked hard at a couple of things. One is we have an interpretive guidelines that's ready to go on Friday. And it's as good as we can get it to the point, but I'm sure there'll be some edits as we go. We have some webinars planned. The guidelines themselves will be followed through those webinars. Our manager of member competence and engagement, Troy Lee, has been working on those and has those well at hand. So stay tuned to the increment and to the website. We'll let you know when those webinars come up, that e-training. Additionally, I think we should review the code standards and the interpretive guide in detail, each of us. We need to, there's a lot of good stuff there, and we're currently building in a compendium of examples to be able to understand how this works. The code itself is called Schedule A in Bylaw 9. And there's a Schedule B that is a list of guidelines.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to keep going with you since you're on the hot seat for questions, and have another follow-up question that relates back to the code, and it's about Standard 9. So over the last year, there's been a lot of conversation about a duty to report provision that's in the Professional Governance Act. And as we just heard from you, Standard 9 of the new code is titled Reporting, and that's where that new duty falls in. So my question for you, Mike, and to help our audience learn about this is, what is the purpose of this new reporting duty, and what triggers the obligation for a report to be made?
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, the concept of duty to report is an important one in the PGA. It's got its own section, section 58, and you should check it out. The words for you there are on the slide. You know, the express purpose is it aims to strengthen reporting of serious concerns about the conduct or competence of a registrant that may pose a risk of significant harm to the environment or to the health or safety of the public. So there's a new obligation there that is still a duty to report that's similar that we've experienced in the past, but it is a positive obligation to act. The trigger to act is the risk of significant harm. The conditions that apply under which that would be triggered, it applies to any registrant of the ABCFP and in fact any regulatory body under the PGA. And then a condition that if a registrant has reasonable and probable grounds to believe. So there's the signal, the condition that it's not just the significant harm, it is reasonable and probable grounds to believe that there is significant harm. And then the significant harm emanates from an identified registrant. So we as a registrant are seeing another identified registrant that is carrying out a regulated practice that may lead to significant harm. Those conditions all support the trigger. So we've been speaking about this as a statutory duty. There is a corresponding ethical duty, and it's in section 9 of the new code. Very similar wording. Then the PGA, you'll hear it because it'll be referred to as the statutory duty to report and then the ethical obligation to report. But they're both very similar.
Mike, you've touched on this a little bit already in some of your comments, but maybe a bit more specifically, can you explain for us how does the existing obligations that we have for reporting under the Foresters Act compare in contrast to this new reporting obligation?
Sure. The standard 9 in terms of its reporting does deal with the reporting requirements of the PGA, and we just went through those. They also in our code standard 8, there's the opportunity to discuss it with another member. In other words, if you have a matter or have a concern that involves a registrant's practice or a harm to the environment that may not rise to the level of significant harm, you can raise that matter. In fact, it's an obligation to raise that matter with another registrant. That's code standard 8E, and you'll see it when you go through. And it is very similar to our past obligation, where you identify the concern, you check and make sure that there's not just a difference of opinion, that you actually have an issue you want to address. You maybe do a little bit of back work to make sure you raise the matter respectfully, and then you resolve or you assist. In most cases, you've discharged your obligation. That's it. It's over. You did your professional duty. But where the concern might still exist, then you can elevate that to a code standard 9, or it may apply to a section 58. One interesting piece about this is that the duty to report in section 58 applies to any regulatory authority. So we as registrants have a obligation to report it not only to the profession involved, but also to any other appropriate authority.
Thanks, Mike. Let's turn the floor over to Casey for a bit and take another question here. So Casey, a fundamental contract people enter into when they decide to become registered as a forest professional is agreeing that their practice and conduct can be reviewed. This review often takes the form of a complaint investigation. Casey, we'd like to hear, how does the complaint process under the PGA compare to the one under the Foresters Act, and are there any significant differences?
Sure. Yeah, there are some key similarities and differences between the existing complaint process and the process we see under Bylaw 12 of the PGA. The graphic that Christine has put up there for us is a flow chart. Now, we don't have a comparative chart, but we had one similar looking under the Foresters Act. I guess the main point is that the complaint process still does what it was intended to do under the Foresters Act, and that is to process complaints in a fair way, to have committees that are specifically designed to perform the functions. In the case of the PGA, they are named specifically in the Act. The number of committees has changed. The investigation committee now largely replaces what we used to know as the Complaints Resolution Committee. And then what we currently call the Standing Investigations Committee is kind of absorbed into that work. And so the big box in the middle there for investigations, we now have inspectors who carry out the direction from the investigation committee. The other observation I'd make about it is the process is less linear. And I think the graphic kind of identifies that. There are a number of different mechanisms and provisions in the PGA that translate into our bylaws. And a couple of them that are worth noting is the inclusion of the audit and practice review, that a matter that proceeds through or into a complaint, there's an avenue to take it to a practice review as opposed to sort of pushing it through a complaint process. At the bottom there, we see noted the extraordinary action. That is a mechanism directed by the PGA that's entirely new. That would be a very unique circumstance. For instance, if there's some sort of an emergency pending harm to the public or safety issue that the council could deal with directly. We also see kind of enhanced measures associated with alternative complaint resolution. Some new mechanisms available there through investigation in terms of a reprimand, remedial action by consent, or a consent order, which is something that we have used quite a bit in our discipline cases. I guess, what else would I say? This is Bylaw 12 under the Foresters Act bylaws. This was Bylaw 13. The duty to report is entirely new. Mike just kind of went through that with everybody. And another piece of it too, under the Foresters Act, our ACR provision required consent of the complainant, and that is not required under the PGA or under the new bylaws. So we can proceed, the investigation committee can direct that we proceed to ACR without necessarily having the consent of the complainant.
Thanks,
I'll
Casey.
stop there, Christine.
Yeah, I think that was great, walking us through some of the procedural and process changes, because that's important for people to know what to expect. But I want to shift it just a little bit and ask you, in your opinion, so what's the benefit of making all of those process changes, for the public and for forest professionals, in your opinion?
I would say for the public, it's primarily increased transparency. Along with this comes some increased requirement for publication requirements for the role of the committees. There's sort of a greater vetting process for the intake of complaints, so the public can have greater assurance that there is more eyes on the issue. In terms of registrants, I think the fact that there's other mechanisms that complaints can go down, like for instance, a practice review, something may have been identified as a concern or a complaint, but the most appropriate outcome for it might be a practice review and recommendations to the member, as opposed to disciplinary action.
Great. Let's keep moving and talk about the audit program next. And Mike, I'm going to turn the floor back to you. So Casey just touched on practice reviews. They have a bit of a different meaning under the PGA, as you can tell, how they're linked into that enforcement component of complaints. And so practice reviews, namely, will be done as opposed to undertaking, they could be done as opposed to undertaking a complaint investigation. And they also can lead to mandatory actions. So the PGA, though, also requires the ABCFP to have an audit program. And so the audit program that's described under the PGA is similar to the program ABCFP has under the Foresters Act, which we've been calling practice reviews. So with all of that lead in, Mike, my question for you is what will the audit program under the PGA consist of, and how will it be different from what we've been doing previously under the Foresters Act?
Thanks, Christine. Well, the first thing is some of the words will change. So there is a lot of similarity. We're told to audit the competence and the conduct of registrants. That's a direction that's in the PGA to the regulator. And so, and there's very specific words and we have to change some of our terminology. So we'll be talking about audits, where in the past, we've always talked about practice reviews, the peer review and the technical practice review. So in the future, those will be audits. The audit program, we're keeping with the same principle that guided us in the change to the code, in that we're going to try and keep as much as possible that is similar, as long as Christine mentioned earlier, we're doing the job already. So we're told to audit for the competence. The competence is, can I undertake the practice? You know, do I have the skills in order to do it? The conduct of registrants is, do I follow the standards in place? Do I use what I'm supposed to use in my daily practice? So we're auditing those two things. We will still, you'll see on the slide there that we have competence audits. Those are the new peer-driven audits, a very structured approach to analyzing another registrant's practice and professional service. And then we'll also have performance conduct audits, professional conduct audits. They're performance-based. And I had a slip of the tongue there because I think we'll get used to calling those performance audits, because it is about what you do. So the practice reviews are similar in that sense. Some of the difference, we will have peer reviews. We'll have a new role called the assessor. And so those are qualified registrants who are capable and have been trained to do these technical audits. It's similar to other professions, like the chartered accountants or the engineers undertake a certain level of those kinds of audits also. The practice review will still exist, and you see that in the second part of the slide there. It's got a very different purpose, as Casey pointed out. It's a door to be able to take what would start off as a complaint and to put it back across to the practice review side. There will be a statutory committee that oversees that process. It's called the Audit and Practice Review Committee, and it will have a layperson on that committee. There's a number of things that process, practice review, I just wanted to finish off with, and that will apply. The first is when you as a registrant goes through a practice review, it's because something happened. It's because there was a complaint. It's because there was an issue that needs to be addressed with your specific practice. It can result in additional education requirements, some sort of limitation on professional service, or it can be actually put back to the investigations committee that Casey looks after.
Thanks for that good overview, Mike. Let's turn the floor back to Casey and talk about the new continuing professional development program. So forest professionals have always had an obligation to maintain their competence and only do work they're competent to do. For the last decade, the ABCFP has also had a voluntary program where forest professionals could receive a certificate of professional development after completing 150 hours of CPD over a 5-year period. In 2017, the ABCFP began considering what a new CPD program might look like that would be both meaningful for forest professionals and their employers, and be more specific about the type and amount of CPD required. The PGA now requires the ABCFP to do both, to set mandatory requirements for CPD and to ensure CPD requirements support reconciliation with Indigenous people. Casey, when will the new CPD requirements take effect, and what will be expected of forest professionals?
Sure. So the new program is really just to some degree a formalization of what we've been doing. So we're expanding on that, and we're incorporating the requirements of the Governance Act. For this year, we have the program in place. It's not going to be mandatory reporting until the end of our fiscal 2022. So this is your year to work through it. It requires 30 hours annually of qualified training or professional development, and incorporates different areas of that, different aspects to it. If you've been seeing our communication on this, you'll see that it relates to, links into your professional competencies, to the declared areas of practice that we now require you to declare annually. And as well, it includes interpersonal competencies. So what we sometimes call soft skills. As Christine mentioned, as you mentioned, we're really trying to make this both adaptable and meaningful. We've done some consultation. We ran some workshops early on to understand how forest professionals learn when they reflected on their own personal practice over a number of years or over their career. What were some of the items that showed up, and when in their career was it relevant? So, you know, there was one piece of feedback we saw loud and clear was the skills tended to be technical in the early stages of the career, and they tended to become more interpersonal or managerial as they advanced in their career. So you're trying to incorporate the fact that at different stages of your career, you're going to need, you know, different competencies and training. Yeah, there's a lot of different ways that training can qualify. So it's not just workshops. It's not formal, you know, pay for a course and do that. There's, you know, what you do on the job, training you do with your employer. A lot of that is going to qualify as well.
Thanks, Casey. One quick follow-up is, what is the ABCFP doing or planning to do to support forest professionals to meet these CPD requirements?
So there's work that we're doing directly, and then there's work that we're planning to do with other parties. Directly, when you look at the sort of professional competencies that are almost exclusive to the regulatory world, we're working on short courses. You'll see that our staff have developed a couple of products already on our website that you can take. We're going to be working on a short course with respect to the new code. And then when it comes to some of the other competencies, as we start to sort through and determine what are some of these declared areas and where do we need to shore them up, we'll be working with other partners. We'll be leveraging our own learning management system, and we'll be working with others to identify any gaps and see those delivered as well.
Thanks, Casey. Moving right along. If only my slide would move. So this one's also for you, Casey. Today, the ABCFP has a publicly available list of all forest professionals who are currently registered. Under the PGA, this public listing is going to start providing significantly more detail than today. What are some of the additional information that's going to be shared on the public register?
Sure, I think it's worth clarifying too that a lot of the information that registrants already provide us with that's in our systems, most of that is covered anyway. The difference is what is the public going to be able to see when they go to our website, and what can they search and find? And you know, that's really driven by, again, the priority of having a transparent regulatory system for the public to be able to check and see who's working in their municipality, or if they have a concernable practice that they can clearly identify who the registrant is. So who is involved? So current and past registrants. So if you retire, resign from the profession, your information will continue to be available for people to search for 10 years. What's going to be included? Your declared practice areas, any limits or conditions on your practice. This would generally come out of disciplinary action of some kind. So disciplinary notations, you know, suspensions or anything like that. But as well, your employer and your employer's contact details, and then the municipality where you reside. And, you know, again, I've mentioned the improved transparency that we're trying to seek. This is going to have to happen by the end of this year, as part of the 1 year we have to come into full compliance. And yeah, as I mentioned, we mostly have this information, but you know, in some cases, people are going to have to go in there and make sure that it's correct, that there's no gaps in your information, and we'll be reminding everybody about this as the need, as it comes into effect.
Thanks, Casey. I'm going to move on to our next and last question before we open up the dialogue. And this one is going to be for Mike. Even though the ABCFP is not immediately planning to implement firm regulation, I know many people are wondering what is to come. Mike, can you explain some of the benefits of firm regulation for both professionals and the employer?
Sure. Thanks, Christine. And while we're just waiting for the slide to come up, there is a lot of conversation around this. It's one of the things that what we work with professional engineers and geoscientists, and that is the first profession that is being turned on. They have been running a voluntary program, so we have the benefit of partnering and collaborating with EGBC in a number of areas of our practice, and this is yet another one. So why is this in the PGA? It's because it's a public demonstration that a firm supports professional decision making by having processes and procedures in place to foster effective and proper use of professionals who work for them. So that's pretty much why there is the registrant firm. It's been a very successful program elsewhere. The other places in Canada and North America have a similar registration. But why would we want to do it? You know, there's right now, as an individual registrant, I am responsible for my own professional development. With my employer, I have a partner in that growth and development between the profession, myself as a registrant, and my employer. And there's a link to the learning that I would be undertaking in terms of professional development and my practice with a particular employment. There's also, we've noticed that there's a recruitment advantage. For example, the employers who do support professional growth are more highly sought after than those that do not, that leave the registrant as a single entity trying to advance themselves in terms of their practice and knowledge. And then there's a reduced cost of combining registrants together, not only forest professionals, but also many firms have a multiple of regulated professionals that work there. And we're working with the other professions to have a single point of entry so that when there is a registrant firm that it has 2 or 3 other regulated professionals, then that is combined, and we as professions work together to ensure this is a single window of entry. Christine, also, those are some of the benefits, but I see there's the when down there that you didn't ask about, but you mentioned earlier, it's going to take 3 to 5 years in the moment. That's the expectation. We'll just have to see how it rolls out.
Thanks, Mike. And I can see the questions are starting to roll in. There's about 29 of them already. So it's time to move to our audience and start taking questions from there. So if you haven't already been entering them, you can enter your question into the Q&A field at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And you can also vote for questions that you'd like to see answered. You can upvote these items. So let's end the slideshow and open up the conversation. So I just have to get the Q&A opened here. First question that's on the top of my screen is, how does the information detail be aligned with a violation or protection from FOIPA? So Casey, this sounds like it's in reference to our new online register and the additional detail there. How does the information detail align with a violation or protection from FOIPA?
Okay, I'm just trying to understand that. It sounds as though the requirements, it's a question regarding the requirements of FOIPA versus the PGA. From my understanding, there's no conflict there in the information that we're requiring registrants to provide. I don't believe that there's any infringement there of personal privacy, if that's kind of where the question is going at. But there are provisions within FOIPA for the purpose of regulating professions as well.
And I would just add, certainly privacy issues were considered by our lawyer, by government's legal counsel as this stuff was established, and so it has been carefully reviewed. Let's keep moving. Next one here from Brian Barber. Are there issues or conflicts with ABCFP as the profession's regulator and investigator providing competency training to its members? So it's an interesting question. Maybe I can start and I'll invite Casey and Mike to contribute as well. I don't think there is any conflict there. We have separate roles that we perform, when our job is a regulator. So I think you might be, referring more into the complaint and discipline part. It's a very structured process that's done by different staff than the staff who are providing competency training. So I don't see where the conflict would arise. It certainly can be, and it has been challenging in the past. And I think Casey could speak to it, that if you have to wear multiple hats, you have to be very conscious of that. And so you can get into a challenge there, but I don't see a direct conflict here with that regulatory role and making efforts to help people maintain their competency. But Mike or Casey, would you add to that?
I would say that, I think the question is getting at, whether it's contradictory to be doing two things. And as a regulator, even if you were to divorce entirely, which we largely have, the advocacy effort, or for instance, exclusively providing training services as a member benefit, for lack of a better word, the role of a regulator is to ensure that its registrants are competent and accountable. So we're doing both of those things. And even though there's some duality there, as you mentioned, Christine, we have departments that manage those separately. We check in with one another. I think we're well aware of where there may be some tension in those things, but they are very much part of our mandate.
Thanks, Casey. Let's move to our next question from Christine. Will there be sign-off required with the new code, or is it just assumed that if we're part of the association that it applies to us? Mike.
Well, there will be the similar signing and sealing bylaw, but will we actually have to sign the new code? On Friday, it'll be assumed by the world that you are following the new code, period, full stop. And so that whenever you're engaged in practice, whenever your conduct is applied, whether as an individual or as a professional, you'll be subject to the code.
Thanks, Mike. I know one of the questions that I received this week from one of the registrants asked me, are we going to have to rewrite that ethics exam? And I can confirm for you the answer is no. And I know that was quite a relief to the person who was asking that question. So let's keep moving along. Our next question is referring to our practice definition from Kenneth. Has the practice of professional forestry been redefined in any way? Mike, how about you start?
Sure, that's an interesting one. I mean, I think we spent hours on this talking about the possibilities, and I think Christine alluded to some of the anxiety around it. The practice of forestry, we now have a regulated practice and a reserve practice. And you'll hear us more often talk about the regulated practice. It's a larger umbrella than we had before, if you want to use an example. And the definition of the practice of professional forestry that we knew before is now a smaller piece under that umbrella. So the regulated practice of forestry, we're told to superintend that regulated practice, which is virtually the composite of everything that we do in forest lands, forest resources, and forest ecosystems. Whereas specific knowledge is required, then that is where it would fit into reserve practice. You will see the words come Friday, and so we'll be able to talk about it in a little bit more detail and actually talk about what do the words mean.
Yeah, and actually the professional forest, or the forest professionals regulation, which get used to all these new words and language, that regulation was deposited by OIC, by the government last week. So it's already out there. And we'll be sharing links to all this information later in the week. But you know, the biggest thing and the most important takeaway is there are some new words being used to describe it, but nothing has changed. We are effectively carrying forward what we had done previously, but we're going to use different words to talk about it. So we're going to have to get used to that, and that means we're going to have to up our game with even more communication products and tools to assist on the understanding inside our profession, but even outside. So you can expect in this year to see more details around understanding the scope of our profession's practice and the elements that are reserved. Next question is for Mike from Ross. Can you highlight the duty to report other professionals, like say a biologist or engineer?
Thanks, Ross. I haven't had the pleasure to look at the ethical duty to report for those other professions yet in detail. We're more focused on our own, but the Section 58 applies to any registrant of any of the 5 professions that are under the PGA. And architects will soon be a 6th profession under the PGA. So it applies to a forest professional looking or having a concern about something that a biologist is doing or a professional engineer in the same way. And remember, I mentioned that there's the obligation to bring it to the attention of the proper regulatory authority, but also any other authority like a branch of government.
Yeah, and just to add to Mike's answer, also remember that reporting duty, there's the triggers, you know, significant harm, reasonable and probable, and that the person is actually doing a regulated practice. So it's not that about the policy they're implementing, it's they're engaged in the profession's service. So, you know, some of those things will be important to understand. And it's part of the reason the government, I believe, added this in here is their belief was that other professionals are in the best place to recognize when regulated practice is happening in a way that could cause significant harm.
You know, Christine, just one more thing about that. I've been thinking that in comparison to what registrants have been used to in the past, the new duty to report is both narrower and greater. So it's narrower in the sense that it was always our responsibility to come forward on seeing poor forest practice or misconduct, poor forest stewardship, a very broad thing. You didn't necessarily have to see a professional service that led to that action. So it's narrower in that sense. And then it's greater because it's a statutory duty. It's not something that the profession is imposing. We are through an ethical standard, but the statutory duty is the full weight of law on us as individuals.
Thanks, Mike. Our next question is, many criticisms are made by other parties about self-regulation in the past 15 years. Do you think the ABCFP and the government are in a better position to defend our profession with the establishment of the OSPG, enactment of the PGA, and all of these additional measures? Great question. To be, you know, I think in some ways, you know, we were in a strong position before, but, you know, we're going to be in a strong position after with the OSPG and the PGA as well. When you look back on the past, a lot of the criticism wasn't necessarily about self-regulation. It was often about professional reliance and used as a proxy. And so you have to unpack it all to really start evaluating where's the concern. But that's not to say that there wasn't any concern here. I think some of the benefits of us moving forward under the PGA is it brings greater transparency, it brings greater consistency that all natural resource regulators will have certain elements and act in a certain way. You know, the OSPG's existence is there, they'll be auditing us. So there's an opportunity, someone independent of us saying we are doing what we ought to be doing. and it'll be validating of the efforts that we've been taking. You know, I'm proud of the work the ABCFP has been doing, and in many ways, the OSPG having oversight will be a way of another body to recognize that good work. And I think that'll help us with public trust and continued strength and credibility. Mike or Casey, anything to add before we move?
I agree.
I was going to say yes. I think we are in a better position. We've reinforced the things that we were already doing, and I think shed some more light on them. We're talking about them more. We've obviously having more interactions with the office of the superintendent, but also with our peer regulators. And all of this is just strengthening what we do and showing gaps where we may have had them.
Next question, this looks like a Mike question from Dave Haley. Does the upcoming training speak to issues such as risk of wildfire affecting the community as having a reasonable risk of significant harm or damage?
Yeah, you know, this is something it never come up in our presentation, but now that we do have the office there as the regulator of the regulators, a lot of these things require interpretation. The office will be producing guidance and has had a couple of drafts that we've been contributing towards. So we're now partners with the office in defining some of these things. One of them is, what is the definition of significant harm? And it is intended to be significant. It's not meant to be, on the other side of the scale, frivolous. It's not meant for us as registrants to decide, is it significant harm? And I decide one thing and Casey decides something else. So we'll get some direction there from the office. Maybe that's one of the benefits. And I'm hoping that the training will unpack some of this. I can actually see our training will be all encompassing. However, I can actually see just a session on this alone, you know, implementing the duty to report. Stay tuned, Dave.
Yeah, and I do think the Office of the Superintendent is reaching out to some of our training providers to start working on that training. So hopefully staying tuned sooner than later on that front. Next question is from Steve. Can any PGA registrant report another, i.e. can a report of a forest professional come from a registrant from another profession? Short answer, yes. It actually could before as well. You know, Casey did a presentation this morning on our some of our complaint trends. In the last 5 years, about 5%, I think, came from other registrants of other professions. But the difference now under the PGA is the duty to report, where, and that's what Mike was just talking about, those significant harm circumstances where the registrant is engaged in regulated practice in a way that could create significant harm. Now they're obliged to make that report. Next question is from Mike Simpson. Reporting in Section 58 and any PGA registrant. Does that mean an RPF can report against a PEG or PN? Doesn't the lack of knowledge of other professions limit the ability to understand whether something inappropriate is being done? So a bit similar to our last question, and it does come back to why I think the government felt it was important that professionals have this obligation, because there is a belief that professionals are out there on the land base, they're seeing this stuff, and they do often work alongside other professionals and have insight. But you do have to know what you're looking at. And that's why the duty to report does have those limits in there, that you have reasonable and probable grounds. You understand that that is regulated practice. You know that that's an identified registrant. So, you know, this stuff is going to have to play out a little bit to see how it goes and find where some of the bumps are. It's new, but you know, there are some factors for limiting. You know, we don't want frivolous or vexatious reports being made.
We are science-based professionals, so there is a foundation science that goes into understanding our work. And remember, it's significant harm. So the fact that there might be a lack of knowledge is trumped by the fact that there's an emerging concern, a strong emerging concern. So significant harm, that's the trigger. The other thing I like to think about is that, I think on all of us, there's an obligation to learn before you actually act on the privilege to speak. So we do have a responsibility there, not to throw around frivolous complaints.
Next one is a great one for Casey to take from Patrick. What's a consent order?
Good question. Sometimes the legalese, it doesn't translate so well, but it is literally someone who's subject to a complaint giving consent to the making of an order. So generally that involves some form of conditional admission, like of a breach of the bylaws or the act, and they consent to the discipline committee making an order for discipline. So that includes whatever remedies are either negotiated or that the discipline committee feels is appropriate for the breach.
Thanks, Casey. Next question is from Tyler. A bit more of a comment than a question. Current ABCFP bylaw 6121 is critical to maintaining competence. And while Mike probably has memorized every single bylaw down to that detail, I have a reference book. So I looked that up, and 6121 says RFTs may engage in aspects of the practice of professional forestry to the extent consistent with their education, training, and experience. And that, the idea of competence and being qualified, that is something that'll be in our new code. Under one of the standards is titled competence. And we agree with you. It's critical that people have the knowledge, skills, and training to be competent to do that work. Kind of a carry on in the next question that followed is the code under competence now reads as skill and ability instead of education, training, and experience. Can you explain, Mike, how skill and ability is defined and how that compares to education, training, and experience?
Sure. The education, training, and experience was a piece of the Foresters Act, and it also was a trigger for RFT scope of practice. It enabled us to have that soft edges of deciding what our registered forest technologist could do straight out of school, for example, in a newly minted RFT, as opposed to one that developed experience over time. That was a test of authority. In Code 1 is about competence, and we'll see competence standard be used more as a word than the skills necessary to do the job or the skill and ability. So it'll be very specific. Our guidelines will have practice standards, and they'll be bolded to say this is a practice standard, we must do it. This is a competence standard, we must do it. So, and then there'll be a list of the kinds of skills that you need or the abilities you need to be able to undertake to do that particular work.
Next question is from David. Audits generally have an audit protocol. Does the ABCFP have these protocols available to be reviewed? Mike.
Thanks. A great question. The short answer is not yet, but we are Paul Nuttall, who works on our team as the Deputy Director of Forest Stewardship. He is taking the lead on putting together what might be a made for forest professionals protocol. And we're building a manual for the assessors. So we'll have a nice established written material for everyone to see. We do have this transition year, as Casey pointed out earlier. So we're working on those things now. We expect to have the new Audit and Practice Review Committee up in around June. So a lot of our year will be spent working on things like this. So thanks.
So next question, Mike, you're probably in a good position to answer this one from Brian. Can you comment on the registration of firms and what firm versus individual audit will look like?
Absolutely. I mean, we've already done one team review, just so everyone knows. We are taking steps to educate ourselves as a regulator, and then, like I mentioned before, partnering with EGBC. The audit of a firm is about all the individuals and the interactions, whereas the audit of an individual registrant is about the things that you do relative to what are the competencies you have and then your particular practice. The firm enables us to think about the group and how they apply professional service as a team, which is unique and probably more typical of forestry. We did do, like I mentioned, one this year. It was a lot of fun to do, to see forest professionals at work.
Thanks, Mike. Here's another one. It was actually, it's submitted by Bowen Sly, who is a member of our council. And it was also one of the questions I had as a prompt for you, Mike, but we ran out of time and I didn't ask it. Is it foreseeable a registrant that recently undertook a review under the Foresters Act, so I think this is a practice review under the Foresters Act, may be soon selected to take an audit under the PGA? Another way of asking that is, do I get an exemption if I just had an audit under the Foresters Act, or am I back in the pool when the PGA audit program turns on?
Yeah, there's, did I see there that Bowen's name is at the top of the list for an audit? Is that what I know? No, thanks, Bowen, for your question. Great question. We are taking steps to ensure that that somebody who does an audit this year is not at the front of the line for next year. You know, so there is a regular pool. What does disappear though is the 10 years of no audits. Simply can't do that under the PGA. Every year we're expected to demonstrate competence. So there's a difference between actually being competent and then being able to demonstrate competence before you actually do the task. So everybody's going to be in the pool. We'll also be targeting audits. So they, depending on areas of practice, for example, if the Forest Practices Board identified forest crossings, or recently the ombudsperson identified issues around Forest Service roads, we may use that third-party identifier as a target for the audits in the current year. Thanks, Bowen.
With the upvoting, the way the questions present, they jump around a bit on you, so you think you're going to answer one and then something else is at the top. So the next one here is from Ian Moss, and it says, what exactly does it mean to be a science-based profession? And how do we know whether we are exercising our decisions within scientific norms? This seems to be a difficult thing to enforce and is more a matter of discretion and professional reliance based on training. Something may go wrong, albeit as an unintended consequence. So Mike, I think this was a comment in one of your earlier replies when we were talking about reporting.
Yeah, so what does it mean to be a science-based profession? And how do we know whether we're exercising our decisions within scientific norms? I mean, you know, forestry is not about just the physical or the biophysical sciences. It's also social science, a lot of it. In the last 20 years, I think many of us have learned that quite a bit. There is increasing pressures, social pressures, and lately, as a result of climate change, environmental pressures on an increasingly fragile resource. And so what does that mean as a forest professional? In my mind, it means, Ian, that we are guided by the scientific knowledge that we have in informing decisions that we make. There's also something called the Test of Reasonableness. So in terms of identifying the practice and making those on the stand decisions, I'm using information that is typical and reasonable to the circumstance. And that if I'm judged for that decision, another similarly situated professional would make the same choices. So I'm held to those norms that aren't necessarily scientific norms, but they are the norms of application of our profession. And that's one of the foundational reasons why we have a profession.
Thanks, Mike. Next question is from Molly Hudson. And she says, your perspective on the changes seems overwhelmingly positive. What things from the outgoing system will you miss? And what in the new PGA framework needs improvement? This is probably a great question for all of us to weigh in, but I'll give it a start. And I'll just comment on the positive part. You know, for me, one of the things I recall a couple of years ago, and it's been that long now, sitting in a Vancouver office with Minister Heyman. And I was battling pretty hard that why do we need this PGA? We've got an act, just tune it up for whatever you need, but you know, why throw out the baby with the bathwater model? And the minister at the time pretty much told me to read his lips, the act was coming. And at that moment, I realized, you know what, we're fighting a battle that we're going to lose. So how do we find opportunity in the change? And I personally believe every time something is changing, there's positive opportunity within it. And you can either find the negative stuff or you can lean into the positive. And that's my personal style here, is that this is happening. So let's not fight it, let's leverage it and take some of the benefits. You know, and you can look at that in a bunch of different ways. You know, the bylaws, for example, you know, they're shifting. We had to rewrite them. It was a massive amount of work. How did we inspire ourselves to get the energy to do that? We also saw it as an opportunity that there's some things that were really outdated that you just never get to. We wrote those things out, things that were burdens and they were inefficient. We wrote those type of things out. We had an opportunity to focus on things that were going to matter more. And we had a chance to kind of make some continuous improvement. Even though it was going 100 miles an hour, we tried to write those continuous improvements in. But, you know, in terms of what needs work going forward, the practice rate stuff, that was challenging. You know, when you read the regulation that was developed, and it's pretty sparse. It pretty much, you know, we asked for the Foresters Act definition to become a backstop to help people understand the practice of professional forestry by being able to reference back to the Foresters Act in case it was confusing what was in the Forest Professional Regulation. But the design, the modern design of practice definition that was used was to say, you know, you're essentially, the practice of forestry is when you're relying on someone who has the skills, knowledge, and experience of a person who's registered in the forest profession. You know, it's very broad, and then it sets some broader context. We're going to have to work that stuff out, and that's going to need some effort. And also others are being granted practice rights under the PGA who don't currently have them. So we have to talk about how those are going to intersect. One of the other things I comment on that really, in our perspective, needed a lot of improvement before it could be turned on was the PGA actually has a section in it on competence and conflict of interest declarations. This part was going to be really tricky, and I was really happy that the government heard us on that comment, and they decided that's the one section they did not turn on the PGA framework. I'm hoping they can see that we have a ton of things in place that address that already, and maybe it's not as necessary to move forward with it, but those are some of the things we really have to figure out moving forward.
You know, I like that question, and because I was had the same feelings as you right in the beginning. I think it probably lasted 8 months where we were saying, why are you doing this? And I felt the burden of 75 years. You know, the 75 years as a profession that I came into, and people before us. I mean, the story is you stand on the shoulders of those that came before you, and it felt like that was being taken out from under us. So, you know, I think that still has a bit of a scar there. Also, the individual member is no longer a member, they're a registrant, they're losing direct connection to the profession. So we don't necessarily vote on specifically things that direct our profession, and the regulator, us as a profession, are closer to the government. So there's been a shift that's happened. So those things I feel the weight of personally. On the other side, though, we've never had such a vigorous intercollaboration with our other professions. It's been really good. There's a lot of productive ground there for us to work on, and with the other professions, I'm really looking forward to building better guidance, more specific guidance, and we'll need our registrants to help us do that. Also, the last thing, Christine, I think the OSPG is new right now, but I think there's tremendous possibility there as a really valuable partner, and a collective voice of all the professions versus just the forest profession speaking out. So I have a lot of encouragement and hope thinking about that group of individuals.
Christine, we have 5 minutes left.
Great, thanks. And 65 questions to go. Can we do it? No. We're going to have to do some follow-up, and we will develop an FAQ based on all of these great questions. I'm looking at the list, and the next 4 questions all deal with the new CPD program. So I'm going to try to rapid fire these and see if we can get them all in. If you have significant hours in any one year, can they carry forward to the next? No, that hasn't been anticipated in how we've structured the program. Will trainees be required to meet CPD requirements? The CPD program is for practicing RPFs and RFTs. How do you arrive at 30 hours? Casey mentioned there's a lot of different ways to get there. If you noticed when you were looking at the program, for example, for today, it would tell you on the program how many CPD training hours were here, and it listed the learning objectives you can expect. We're going to have that's the type of things where you're going to have to count up training things like this. But when we get out to you the program details, you'll also see, just like in our current voluntary program, there's other ways to arrive at it, doing presentations, having professional conversations with others. So that detail is going to come out to you, but where you could look for right now is at our voluntary CPD program. A lot of those same principles will carry forward. So we're down to the last 2 minutes, and I see that we have a ton more of questions, so we're going to have to stop there. I am committed, and the rest of the team are committed, that we will take your questions away today, turn them into an FAQ, and combine that with some of the other questions that we already have. We know you're going to have a lot more questions like this, and so you can expect that we're going to have webinars over the next couple of months, so that we are available to answer these type of questions. And I just, I offer the one last other thing is it is a lot. As a member of the staff team, I've been internalizing this for 18 months as it was coming. And so, the shock of it all is behind me. And I do appreciate that it is a lot to take in, for registrants. But rest assured, you already know the underlying principles of our code. You already understand the way our business runs. There's going to be changes to some of the details, but we're going to help you learn that and bring you along with us, and just keep asking the questions, and we'll do our best to provide forums like this where you can talk about it, but also a variety of products, from written materials to e-courses to webinars. And I just thank you for all of the engagement today. Mike or Casey, any last closing remark?
No, well said. Thank you.
Nothing here. No, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm getting the cue that we are out of time. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon.